Welcome to the seventh lecture for the Neural Network Architecture seminar at the Towards AI Discord server. Today we'll be talking about graph processing networks. In particular, the idea of having a network that processes a graph is quite ambiguous in a way, and we're going to discuss about that. There is this local processing that can be done within graphs versus a global processing where a graph is just the input. We are going to discuss 4 different architectures, GNNs, that are the antecessor to message passing neural nets that we're going to see in the last half of the lecture. And then we're going to look at convolutional approaches over neural nets, what is called as GCNNs, and one particular type that I like quite a bit, call it DGCNNs. So let's dive in. If you don't have much time to spend on graph neural networks and you have to have some intuitions and ideas, there used to be this online publication called Distill that is currently paused in publication, that makes for papers, but not to be printed, but to be interactive experiences online. And there is this excellent artifact, online publication called A Gentle Introduction to Graph Neural Networks. This page will really help you get an idea of message passing networks, so we're going to discuss about it at length. The page is very well written and it's very easy to understand. However, it is missing the convolutional, and the Distill itself has a link to another Distill paper published that year on convolutional networks. So if at least try to browse the CNN one to get an idea about the pros and cons. But for all these graph processing architectures, the key part here is extremely variable size input. Yes, you have different number of nodes, different number of edges. Yeah, graphs are very rich mathematical artifacts. Yeah, and then the thing is, you have a graph. You change the order of the nodes. You change the order of the edges. And depending on how you are representing the graph, that's a very different artifact. That's a different construct. Yeah, this graph is these two graphs are exactly the same mathematical element, but they will look very different for the neural network. Yes, for processing them. So basically, what we want is something that is invariant over graph isomorphism. Graph isomorphism means that you are mapping these two graphs, that these two graphs are a synonym for each other. Yeah. So in the same way that you want to be able to have for certain circumstances to be invariant to the changes in ordering on the input, here you want to be able to be invariant on much larger concept that is this set of edges and set of nodes. Yeah. And that, of course, speaks of a very strong inductive bias. Yeah. So we have 2 different schools of thought about it. One is to use the graph structure to diffuse information through nodes and edges, and the nodes and edges do not change. Yes, and that's how we have GNNs and message passing networks. And the other is to extend the convolution operation to operate over graphs. And we have graph convolutional network, GCNNs. This extension of the convolution operation is a little tricky, because it is done mathematically over a matrix that is induced from the graph, the adjacency matrix. So just to warn you that the convolutional extensions are actually very knee deep in math. Yeah. So the key question here is what is the input to a graph processing neural network? And it's fascinating because people work in one type of problem with graphs. They really equal the whole graph processing to only that problem. Yes. So for example, if you are doing something where the graph, for example, is fixed and it's a very large graph, and you are just operating on a particular neighborhood within that graph, yes? So then your input is a node within this large graph, yeah? And then the graph itself is kind of implicitly encoded by the neural net, yes? So this way of considering graph processing, of course, has tons of practical applications, and many people see graph processing as just doing this, yes? If you try to find, say, influencers on social networks, this is what you will be doing. And here then the problem is finding mini batches, yes? Because you want to find subgraphs that are equivalent in this large graph in order to get good gradients, yeah? Alternatively, you can operate over graphs, and that your input is a graph, and this will be a large number of small graphs, yes, and you are wanting to be doing things like classification or finding certain whether certain nodes within these graphs that have a particular property, yeah. That will be very different than if you're operating over a large graph. And maybe you have a mixture of both. You have a graph and a distinguished node, yeah? So we talk then about a distinction between graph-focused processing versus node-focused processing. And when we say node, we also say edges, because graphs are dual representation. You can take a graph and transform it into another graph where its nodes are its edges, and vice versa. So that makes that also studying the papers in the field a little tricky, because they are both talking about graph processing neural networks, but what they mean for processing is quite different. So one of the earlier papers in using neural nets for processing graphs is from 2009 by Scarselli and co-authors, yeah, and this is a precursor of the the message passing architecture, so we are not going to look at it in detail. But the important part for us is the definition of the problem that stays for message passing networks, yes? So what they're trying to do here is to take a graph, a distinguished node, and then map that into a vector of n floating point numbers. So this is computing an embedding for a graph. Yeah, and they build on the concept of recursive neural networks and random walk models. Very, very relevant to us is they collect, they describe different examples of tasks within this framework of taking a whole graph as input and a distinguished node that are amenable for graph processing. And here in this figure you can see 3 different tasks. In one you receive a small molecule. This one picture there is adrenaline, and you try to classify it or see properties, whether it be hydrophilic or not, or things like that. So that whole area is huge, and there is a lot of interest on and a lot of use of neural networks for that particular task. The second figure, so figure 1b there, you have an image, and you are trying to do find where the points in the nodes in black belong. You're trying to say that the nodes in black belong to the object, while the nodes in white belongs to the background. Yeah, so that type of classification, we have seen that convolutional neural networks can do it at once with this semantic panoptic segmentation, etc. But it can also be attempted using graph processing, particularly if you want to do a few points and do it fast. And finally, you have a small social network of web pages in a computer science department, and you are trying to determine the importance, the centrality of different people within that small neural network. Yeah, and that's these problems are very different. Yes, but they all boil down to process a graph. In the case of GNNs and message passages in general, is they take the graph and they assemble it as the graph becomes the neural network architecture. Yeah, so each processing unit has is associated with a node in the graph, and they are linked to other neurons based on the adjacency list. Yeah. So these processing units then update their state and exchange information until they reach a stable equilibrium. And the output of the GNN is just computed locally at each node. There are constraints to ensure that there is a unique stable equilibrium at the end of the whole process. And if this looks similar to Hopfield networks we saw in the second lecture, it's because Hopfield network will be a fully connected graph in this representation. We are not going to drill down on the details about the update mechanism and stuff, because the field has progressed quite a bit since then, and we now use message passing that encompass this approach. But it's important to get the background topics. On the other hand, we have the idea of using a convolution operator. And instead of starting with the paper that introduced GCNs, I'm going to talk a follow-up paper that introduced the concept of DGCNNs. So this paper, I would like to bring it to your attention because it introduces a SortPooling layer, and it's a very, very interesting layer. So when you take these graphs, yes, they are basically a set. It's a set of nodes, and each node has a set of edges. If you want to process this later on by other neural nets, that make it very hard, because you want these sorts to have a canonical representation. And what the authors do in this paper is that they define a special layer that will order the nodes in such a way that after this graph processing, you can use any normal neural network that is not aware that it's processing a graph. And I found that idea very very powerful and can be used for problems outside graph processing. So what they are doing here is graph classification. They take a graph and they're trying to say whether this graph has a property or not. Yeah. So what the SortPooling layer does is it takes the whole graph adjacency matrix, and what the DGCNNs do is they consume the whole graph adjacency matrix and produce representation for the nodes. Yes, and these representations are ordered so that they can be that similar graphs will produce similar representations. And it's a neural net generalization of a 1968 graph node coloring approach. So, I mean, graph has been studied in mathematics for a very long time, and there is a lot of powerful processes. Yeah. So the key part then is that the output will be comparable and meaningful for graphs that are similar. And also the SortPooling layer passes gradient throughs. So the whole node coloring and classification can be trained end to end. So you have the input graph, you have the graph convolutional layers, which we are going to see next with GNNs. And then you have this sort pooling that just sort the vertices using these colors that the system, these scores that the system is learning from the different iterations. The part that is fascinating is that this sort operation, you can actually send gradients through. Yeah, and afterwards, this is sorted, and you have for each node there a fixed position where you can send it through a dense network. So that's for this what I want to share about DGCNNs. The question, of course, is then how do you do this graph convolutional layer? And that's they draw from an earlier paper from Kimpf and Welling that defines GCNNs. And this paper is actually quite heavy mathematically speaking. They use Chebyshev approximation of the graphs, and I mean, for me, the paper was quite hard to follow mathematically speaking. And at the end of the paper, they arrived to this formula that I put here in the slide, and the formula itself is very simple and the whole and straightforward. Yes, it is interesting to see how they arrived to that formula, motivating it with first order approximations of convolutions over the spectral graph. Yes, so the spectral graph is the graph that is obtained by doing I believe the SVD decomposition of the adjacency matrix. Yes, and from there they get the Laplacian of that, and let's give you an idea of the divergence between nodes. Yeah, so the formula they arrive at the end is you take the adjacency matrix, you add loops, so that you get this A tilde matrix by adding the identity diagonal, that's equivalent to adding loops. Yeah, and then you we compute for each node the amount of incidence that node takes in this D tilde matrix, and we use that in a way to normalize the adjacency matrix, and we compute this a circumflex matrix by normalizing the adjacency matrix using this incidence. Yeah, and once we have that, a two-layer GCNN can be simply defined as we have certain features X that are defined for each graph node. We have a matrix W0 and W1 that we're trying to learn. So we take a circumflex multiplied by X multiplied by W0, apply a nonlinearity in the form of a ReLU, and then we do a second layer, again multiplying by a circumflex and W1, and that's our network. And we train this by stochastic gradient descent. Sadly, for this type of system, you cannot do mini batches. The others just fit the whole graph in memory and do one update at a time. But this does work, and then you can combine them with a sort pooling layer to obtain an embedding for the whole graph. So as we start adding more layers of this type of convolution, then the information from nodes start traveling further and further away, following the links in the graph, which of course, give us an idea of message passing, which we will see in the second half of the lecture. And let's take a break here and talk about questions and comments.
Okay, so let's try to add a little bit more understanding about these Laplacians and why we consider these convolution filters over graphs. Yeah. So in the other Distill publication, De Gavani and co-authors discuss with interactive presentations how this concept of the Laplacian for the adjacency matrix allow us to define this type of filters over graphs. And the key idea here is to consider the filters as a polynomial over these Laplacians. Yeah. So we have a set of weights, W0, W1, W2, till a certain width, WD. Yeah. That make a polynomial over this Laplacian that is obtained from the adjacency matrix. So those weights are now the type of weights we will expect in a convolutional filter. And it can be seen, that they show it there on the paper, that the width of the filter, what it means is how far without the neighborhood of a node the neighbors influence the result of that filter. And what we are doing here with these filters is to obtain representations for a node. So we are making node embeddings. And the Distill publication contains the following graph to explain how the Laplacian comes about. Yeah. So we have a particular input graph. In this case, the distinguished node C. The Laplacian for this graph is shown in the right-hand side matrix, yeah, and you have a particular row there that corresponds to C. Yep. So again, as we saw on the GCN paper, the Laplacian is obtained by taking the adjacency matrix A, adding a diagonal identity, which means like adding loops, and then subtracting using the in-vertex, using the number of nodes that come into each node to provide a way of normalizing the matrix. This is the normal Laplacian. In general, the actual Laplacian that is used also involves normalizing this by the larger eigenvalue. Otherwise, these numbers explode in size. Yeah, but with this type of formulation, then we can do something that behaves the same way as a convolutional filter over graphs. And most importantly, these type of operations are node order equivariant. So if we reorder the nodes, they still produce the same result, which is the type of inductive bias we want for graph processing. Now, if we think about this, we have information that is going from one node to another, and in each of these operations, in each of these time steps, the information is diffusing through the graph. And that leads to the last topic we're going to see today, which are messaging passing networks that take this intuition of diffusing information over the graph structure and apply it as the key mechanism for doing graph neural nets. So neural message passing is attributed to this paper by Gilmer and co-authors from 2017. That is a paper focused on quantum chemistry. And this is one of the things that makes studying neural network architectures challenging, you have all these contributions to neural network architectures that are presented in very different venues and for very different audiences. This paper is a very interesting paper. About at least a third of the paper is actually very involved on quantum chemistry. So what the author said in this paper is, well, there are all these different models proposed in the literature. They describe 8 different models, yes? And they say, well, these models vary a lot in terms of their complexity and the beauty in which they are described mathematically, yeah? But on those grounds, it's very hard to say which model is better. So what the author said is, we should just focus on empirical results, and rather than keep proposing new architectures, try to see if all these have already been proposed, which ones are better. And that's something that from a larger perspective in neural nets is happening a lot. It's much easier to propose something new than to understand why something that has already been proposed works or that does not work. Yeah. So until then, everything. I mean, I completely agree on those claims. But then they go in to say that the way to evaluate these empirical results is in their particular problem, which is a very important problem for which there is a lot of data. That is, the problem is of taking a graph representing a quantum structure and then deciding whether it has certain properties or not. And those type of characteristics can be settled using a quantum simulation system. Yeah. So this graph represents different molecules, and they want to compute 13 different properties over those molecules. Yeah. So they do have access to a quantum simulation system that produces accurate results for computing these properties, but this system is so slow that a neural network system trained to approximate the simulator is 300,000 times faster than the simulator. Yeah. And I mean, imagine how heavy this is, that a neural net is 300,000 times faster. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that they have 130,000 molecules with these 13 associated properties. The problem with this is that in terms of graph processing, this is only one of the tasks. This is the task of receiving small graphs and classifying them and producing things for them. As we discussed throughout the lecture, there are multiple other tasks of a graph that might not necessarily be captured by this particular task. So, but keeping this in mind, that this is what they are working on and what they are thinking about, then they propose an overall encompassing architecture that captures all these 8 models, and in an appendix you can capture more other models. It has 2 passes, a message passing that is done multiple times, and a readout that produce a full graph feature vector. So these phases of message passing involve several operations during this message passing. And the key part is that these operations are done over the neighborhood of a node. In a way, these are operations that are invariant in terms of the ordering. So, for example, if you take the max over the neighborhood, the order of the nodes won't change. The same if you multiply them or you add them. Yeah. So they have then in this message passing a series of pooling operations. Yeah. That have to be, and then they can say, well, these different architectures are proposed are just one particular instantiation message passing when they use this type of pooling. Yes. And in the same way, then you can say, after I do this pooling, I want to apply a nonlinearity, and they distinguish three different types of information that we can work on. We can work on vertex information, we can work on edge information, and they also introduce a global memory. And the system can also operate over this global memory and can choose to bring information from one type of data to the other. Yes. So then include this operation called weaving, in which we go from node, then edge learning, and then edge and node learning. Yes. So basically, the architecture they are proposing has these meta operations that make it very rich, and with all these possible variation, it captures many architectures that are proposed in the literature. It captures it at a conceptual level. That doesn't mean that the technique they have for training these message passing neural nets will be the preferred or the more efficient technique to train on the way that these other architectures are expressed in this message passing architecture. And so, in this perspective, the message passing neural nets have captured a lot of attention and the imagination of people. It may be still too early to say how the field will stabilize. Maybe new ideas will come up. Maybe the convolutional operations will find some other reason for them to be successful. What is for sure is that it is easy to read one of these papers in isolation and believe that this is the only way to achieve this type of processing of graphs. But because the papers are written in a very authoritative way, that this is the only way of processing graphs, which makes sense given that the authors are really involved in doing this type of processing, so this is what they consider. Yeah. As I was mentioning, one of the nice things about the message passing is that they explicitly consider a global node, yes, and then we can also trade information with that global node. This is similar to global attention in transformers, yeah? We saw that, for example, longformers use this type of structure to make certain decisions faster. And of course, what information goes into the global node, what information is stored at the vertices or the edges, is left up to stochastic gradient descent to decide and train this end-to-end. So this is really beautiful and expressive. In reality check, these systems cannot be trained, as far as I understand, beyond 2 or 3 hops. Yes, if you try to stack them this very deeply, they run out of the representations start mashing together, and you don't really get anything further. Most probably, this will be solved in the. This may be solved by now, for all we know. I mean, this is, as I said, topics of very, very active research. And of course, when you start talking about standards, you always have this XKCD about trying to make a standard that encompasses existing standards. In reality, just creates a new standard. Yeah, and I have that feeling at reading this, particularly because they presented this gentle introduction to graph neural networks, and then they posted this other one about convolutional graph, convolution applied to graphs, and they have a link in them saying, well, if you read this paper, you're better off reading this other one, which is rather unusual for research publications to have such type of disclaimers. So that's what I have for graphs. Thanks for joining. Graphs are very close to my research interest. I'm actually belong to a research group in South America that is interested in studying large graphs, particularly social networks and semantic graphs. I have done a little bit of work on DBpedia and Wikipedia related semantic knowledge graphs. One paper in particular, we were trying to predict which pages do not change in terms of knowledge graph in Wikipedia. But that wasn't using graph neural network, we just used regular statistical machine learning. So this is the type of task called link prediction, and it's quite popular. And well, thank you very much for joining.